Welcome back, everybody. Our fourth and final session for the day is a panel titled Persistent Structural Inequalities, Indigeneity and Sovereignty. And it's a pleasure to welcome Brook Andrew, artist, writer, curator, and founder of BLAK Circle of Radical Energy, and director of Reimagining Museum and Collections at the University of Melbourne. Gerald McMaster, curator, artist, and professor at OCAD University, and director of the Center for Indigenous Visual Knowledge, who will join us via Zoom. Jolene, Rickard, artist and associate professor in the Department of History of Art and Visual Studies at Cornell, who also joins us via Zoom. And Tamati-Quennell, curator of modern and contemporary Maori and Indigenous arts. Our moderator is Iftikhar Dadi, John H. Burris professor in the Department of History of Art. Each panelist will present for 20 minutes each, and it will be followed by a panel discussion and Q&A. I would now like to hand over to you, Iftikhar.
Welcome, everyone, and I thank the organizers for organizing this panel. And so we have four speakers in this panel, which is titled Persistent Structural Inequalities, Indigeneity and Sovereignty. Two of our speakers are here, Brook Andrew and Tamati-Quennell, while the Gerald McMaster and Jolene Rickard will be speaking to us via Zoom. But we will be presenting in the order that is listed. So may I invite Brook to please come and make his presentation.
Ngāju ngai ngandaraga, Ngāju Brook Garu Andrew, I'm Manangu for the invitation, and Ngāju Wiradjuri, Kalamide, Ngunnawal and Celtic. So it's Wiradjuri, it's my mother's language, and I introduce myself and also ICU, Ngāju ngai ngandaraga. It's something that's very important for us in my family. Before I get into talking about sovereignty or as an artist, the way in which that my practice has evolved and also the communities and my own community and other communities I work with, new friends I've met here over the last few days haven't really kind of got a context of what is Indigenous Australia, what is First Nations Australia. Some of you might be very familiar with this map, and in fact I'm hoping a lot of you are, but I just wanted to really kind of express the complexity of Australian Indigenous nations. We are nations, and you can see here that this map is not really used that much for land claims because it's not necessarily accurate, but it's a really great teaching tool. And the large kind of brown section on the right-hand side, the kind of grey-brown, I don't know what that is, khaki, is Wiradjuri or Wiradjuri, that's my mother's nation, and just under that is Ngunnawal, which is my mother's father. So coming back here, Gaban, Ngawal Muramgamira. Gaban is, it means strange. And with my own practice as an artist working with cultural objects and museums, I've often found it a very strange place to work in, often a very traumatic space. Even when I talk like this, it kind of brings up a whole bunch of stuff, but it's also incredibly empowering as well. So what this 20-minute, I better hurry up, presentation is about, and I'm really happy to be presenting with Megan, Gerald and Jolene, our friends, Indigenous friends across the globe. But what this is really a little exploration, I suppose, of a theatre script that I've written, and I'm in the process of working with different people of colour and indigeneity internationally to bring this script alive. And I will talk a little bit about this in the context of restitution and repatriation in those journeys. My memory is blurry, but it towers over me with increasing clarity. Struggle to grasp it, but yes, there was another place. Amongst so many others like me, I am connected, tethered to a songline. I hear it clearly from a place far from here. That spirit calls me, the garu, magpie. It warns me. Memory pounds in my head. It pushes through the labyrinth, refusing to be silenced. But here I am in this asylum, and you're all in my face, listening with bated breath, with scowls and judgment. You do not believe me, but I remember my other life. I swear it's not a dream, not a fantasy. I thought I was mad. Massacre tried to beat it out of me, museum gaslighting me, and public turning a blind eye. I still feel the deep cutting up of me into many pieces for the market. The legacy of those cut marks are here and here, parts of my dismembered body sent to the other labyrinths with the other eyes upon my discarded parts. Seemingly healed, seemingly as if caused from an accident, you say I can't possibly remember. I am the Marara Moyalang, the carved tree of ceremony. Marara Moyalang, the core of existence. This is a small snippet of the play from the character called Gulani, which is the tree. It is an extract from the script, which I am working towards, as I mentioned, to be both a performance and a video performance installation. And Gaban, strange, is a theatre script steeped in the practice of Yinjamara Gunana, a Wiradjuri word which translates as active and ongoing respect, honour and being responsible, unhurried and mutual respect. Yinjamara Gunana is my alternative to the popular term decolonial, which for me and many of my Indigenous family and friends does not represent the deep and complex ongoing work from our lived experiences and perspectives. The Gaban script is a journey into museums and trauma sites and reflects the characters' lives which are trapped in a vortex I call the colonial wuba, or hole. Their existence is complicated and fraught with trauma and confusion, which desperately requires maram gidyal, or healing, gure, which is change or transformation, and release to find a gira, a different kind of future, away from colonial repression, voyeurism and judgment. As Indigenous Australians, we are often judged and compared to the so-called primitive peoples the Europeans so-called discovered hundreds of years ago, which makes our work within our communities and abroad in often unsafe museum spaces increasingly difficult, frustrating, and continues actions of trauma. This theatrical script is a journey that aims to reach a space of reset. Many may call this reset decolonial, as I've mentioned, but for me, healing and release from the colonial wuba or hole requires continued actions of Yinjamara Gunana and other Indigenous ways of being. The story of Gaban is told from the point of view of Ngawal Marangamira, which is my Wiradjuri language meaning powerful objects. This is a concept that I have been experimenting with for many years as a way of empowering my broader community and my own practice as a Wiradjuri Celtic artist, and to describe objects I've encountered in art and ethnographic museums which resonate with cultural, spiritual and historical importance. It was a story shared to me by the Indigenous Brazilian artist and activist Dara Tucano when we met in 2019 at MUSPE in Sao Paulo that cemented my thinking and experiences regarding the spiritual power of objects, similar experiences to my own family. She described her visit to a European museum where she saw a Brazilian spirit, and she asked it, "What are you doing here? I can help you, I can take you home." And Daria said that the spirit replied, "I'm fine here, I'm looking after these objects." Ngawal Marangamira describes those objects or artworks in the museum that I believe have the power to speak outside of and transcend Western museological labels and systems, and articulate other ways of being, other knowledge and power that at home my community continues to practice, even though there is also deep loss of some knowledge due to invasion and genocide. The word Gaban, as it is roughly translated as strange, describes my experience accessing and being with cultural materials and objects in museums, collections far from home. This is something that is very complicated, as we all know, kind of accessing these objects and then, of course, returning them home, and this kind of sense of loss and but also kind of joy as well makes it even further complicated when then you have other members of families or kind of distant families that also want to have access to that. So you can imagine the kind of, further beyond the museological kind of drama in even returning the objects. The museum, for me, is a site of deliberia dilnia, or active confusion. For both itself and for me, holding vast collections of great value, but with troubling histories of collecting and displaying Indigenous cultures and bodies. Through the display of ethnographic records, ancestral remains and cultural objects and artworks, museums have contributed to crafted narratives of so-called primitive cultures. Though most museums and anthropologists no longer pursue this agenda, institutions continue to hold vast collections that were once used to demonstrate such race-based theories. These collections are a harmful symbol of injustice, especially confronting in the Indigenous struggle for self-identity, for self-determination, and of course, for sovereignty. We must remember, classifying people as primitive created a ruse for the colonial invasion of lands and the denial of sovereignty. Megan and I, before, were reflecting on, the vastness of Oceania and the thousands and thousands of islands and the slave trade that happened there called blackbirding. There was also, of course, slavery within Australia. And all of these things are quite invisible. A reminder of the rights of Indigenous peoples to access ceremonial objects and land is essential as stated in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Oops, there we go. I'll come back to the picture of my granny. Indigenous peoples have the right to manifest, practice, develop and teach their spiritual and religious traditions, customs and ceremonies. The right to remain, protect and have access and privacy to their religious and cultural sites. The right to the use and control of their ceremonial objects, and the right to the repatriation of their human remains. This is Article 12 from the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The violence cannot be separated from the collecting and classifying practices of the museum. The crafted narrative of the primitive impacted beyond the initial invasion in Australia. My grandmother, here on the far left, but also up the front in the third from the left. My grandmother, Emmeline, or Rosie, grew up in the Arambi mission in Kairauhī in the early 20th century and lived through Australian government policies that severely disrupted Indigenous lives. Strategies to segregate through apartheid laws and breed out Indigenous people were active from as early as the 1860s. In policies of so-called protection. In 1937, at the initial Conference of Commonwealth and State Aboriginal Authorities, an assimilation approach was adopted which vowed to, quote, do everything possible to convert the half-caste into a white citizen, which meant to make sure that cultural genocide was not broadcasted to the world. It was hidden, and still is. These policies effectively banned the speaking of first languages on state-run missions and reserves, and families constantly feared their children would be taken away. Across Australia, the pseudo-scientific ideas about race and blood and primitive cultures, for example, half-caste, quarter-caste, which also underpin the foundation of many ethnographic museum collections, led to the forced removal of thousands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children who were placed in Anglo-Australian families or institutions up until the 1970s. Structures of colonialism remain. For example, although Indigenous people, we only make up 3.3% of the population in Australia, we constitute 27% of the prison population. The weight of these histories is ever present when I am in a museum, and it is difficult to bear the deliberia, delinia, or active confusion, which offers both a state of despair but also relief to see our ancestors' objects. Many Indigenous peoples feel conflicted about the status of these collections, and many museums are currently reassessing their custodianship of these collections and talking about decolonisation and repatriation. As we know, the very famous Mechren report, one noted example. Writing the script Gaban was a way for me to grapple with this active confusion and find a pathway through it to imagine new futures, or gira, for these objects, for museums and for my community and others. The storytelling of Gaban is led by ngawal maramgamira, or powerful objects, informed by a Wiradjuri way of being where these ngawal maramgamira have agency, have a life force, and with us make decisions about who they are and what they are. Developing new and old language and storytelling around these objects is a way to carve out a sovereign space of practice, and not to be limited by Western conventions and histories of the museum. Sorry, there we go. This is a Mararagalani in the Pitt Rivers Museum. Some of you may have seen it. It's a carved tree. These are ceremonial trees. They're very important to us.
Next, you want to switch the image?
Boom. Sorry. I've had a long relationship with these different powerful objects who became the main character of Gaban. So within the script, these objects themselves, some of them are gendered, some are not within our culture. So for example, this tree section or Mararagalani were used for men's ceremonial sites, but other Mararagalani were actually grave sites for people of high degree. The complexity around that for our communities is that we don't often know if this is a grave site or not. So when they're returned to some communities, it creates a division. So some people want to, release the object and say it doesn't matter because our culture's changed now. Where others say, no, you can't show that. You're going to get sick. So it's a really complicated thing. So within writing Gaban, it was a way to kind of, which I'll get to in a minute, to, I suppose, release myself from the reality of this often kind of like really difficult kind of negotiations, which often split families. So this tree specifically was collected from the Wiradjuri and Gamilaroi country in Western New South Wales in the 19th century. It's probably the first tree section that was removed from Australia in the 18th. We're kind of surmising, I've been working with Christopher Morton at the Pitt Rivers Museum, and we're surmising it's kind of maybe around the 1867 Paris Universal Exhibition as part of the collections, natural and industrial products of New South Wales, and was hereafter probably acquired by General Pitt Rivers for his collection. The provenance details of Mararagalani are often not verified, as are the circumstances under which the objects came into the museum collections, which was, of course, for many of us who have these similar experiences in our lives, I mean, this is the never-ending story of what I call the colonial wooba or the vortex, and as Spivak was saying, I think, we're kind of all in it together. It's a bit of a mess, and I don't know how we're going to get out of it. But having really community grassroots-led discussions, which are, as I mentioned before, can be quite messy, is the only way, I think, forward for healing. There are 3 other tree sections I've known of in public collections. There's one in the Museum de Culture in Basel, and also 2 in the Ethnographic Museum in Geneva. And when families sometimes visit these, as we know in this context, it's very confusing, and you may be thinking, what's this got to do with sovereignty and land? I mean, this is our church, it's our mosque, it's our religious space, and for this to be razed to the ground, and also the removal of these sites also returns to the primitivist kind of notion that Indigenous Australians, which is archaeologically proven to be the oldest living culture on the planet for 65,000 years, didn't have any kind of form of civilization. There were very many farming, stone houses, etc., architecture, astronomy, science, medicine, etc. But of course, with the removal of this tree, is a very small kind of reminder of the vastness. Through my role as artistic director of Niran, meaning Edge, the 22nd Biennale of Sydney back in 2020, I worked with Gamilaroi elders to present this 1949 film. We were very lucky, actually, because this was a very tragic situation where some of these sections are actually part of this looting. 1949. And, Aboriginal people were still on missions, my grandmother was still there, etc. And to kind of feel quite helpless about, the kind of, not being able to stop this is quite dramatic. So what we did is the film here documents a museum expedition to remote New South Wales. And that's right, I was saying, we've all got this jet lag. It's been mentioning it a few times. I think that's where a few people have gone home to sleep. The only reason why we have this video footage is because the wife of one of the anthropologists filmed this as a road trip, and so they went from Adelaide in the south of Australia, of course named after Queen Adelaide, went up through Victoria, the state, of course named after Queen Victoria, and went into Melbourne. Now, if she didn't film this, there wouldn't be this kind of evidence, and the evidence is one of the characters in Gaban. And so these is kind of where I've been borrowing, the kind of characters for Gaban. There's a character called Museum, etc., which I'll get to in a minute. The destruction of these trees in 1949 by museum representatives from Melbourne and Adelaide created great despair for the elders, who at the time had no legal rights under Australian or international law to protect the destruction or to protect their cultural heritage, which was happening in plain sight. Most elders at this time were confined to reserves and did not even have the right to vote, let alone to say in what happened to their cultural materials. Today, Gamilaroi elders, which is the nation next to Wiradjuri, are still searching for the trees which were cut down and distributed to a number of Australian institutions. An exciting connection is currently being made, though, between the community and Museums Victoria, who have committed to the repatriation of 23 trees they have in their storage. The important historical film by Balfour, this is called the Balfour footage, shows the brutal reality of the extractive colonial mindset that claimed it was preserving Indigenous cultural objects, but was in fact breaking the continuation of cultural practices by removing these objects from country for the benefit of museum collections and not for the rightful continuation of sovereignty and land ownership. So permissions to show this film at Niran were led by Elder Auntie Rosalind McGregor and included a smoking ceremony at the site of the removal of Kalyanambrai with local school kids. And this was really great because a lot of them didn't even know about this action, and it was only one generation before. Also just wanted to show you this. So these are some of the, so Auntie Ros is the third from the right, and these are all Indigenous people from Gamilaroi and Wiradjuri country, and I'm working with Brian Martin, who's the man in the middle with the blue top and the black jacket, on an Australia Research Council project called More Than a Galani, and we're working with community elders to go to Geneva, etc., and see if we can get the trees back. Just wanted to share a little bit about some of the characters. They're up here. Galani tree, I was just talking about that. There's another character called Photo, or Bundana. Bundana actually means to draw, so we don't have a word for photo in Wiradjuri. And then, of course, this character represents like colonial photography. We all know the kind of masses of that And also Balambanira, which is massacre. This was a character based on a letter which I've acquired in 1854 by James Dixon, who witnessed and was part of a massacre in Victoria. So in writing Gaban, I imagined these Ngawal Marangamira, or powerful objects, as actual living entities, as characters, having dialogue and interaction with other characters that embody functions of Western systems. Key Wiradjuri ways of being and human behaviours that circulate through the colonial Wuba and remain caught in its centrifugal force. Got a few more minutes, I think. In this extract, where are we? Here we go. I just wanted to read this bit here. This is the character memory. So the whole idea of the character memory is to, I suppose, help people remember. The first part of the play that I read out, you could hear trees saying, I think I remember, you all think I'm crazy, you all think I'm mad, but I'm not crazy. I know that everyone was gaslighting me, etc. So this is what memory has to say. Where are you, my sweetheart, Ngurubul, dear? Let us meet in Ngurubul, this long for love. Meet the soul deep inside of you. Nanangira, Tulubangira, Ngua, Ngayal, Kuringira. Take care, my beautiful, are you travelling alone? So it's really a love song, and I kind of needed to have this within the play. And to just finish, I actually wanted to show this photo, because at the moment, as I'm here, Brian and the mob that I showed you before, the elders, are actually on country right now doing ceremony and working out a plan for us to go to Geneva. And that's Auntie Pauline and Aaron collecting bush tucker. So if that's not saying anything about sovereignty in our land, I think that, we know where to get our food, we know who we are, and I think the world's got a bit of catching up to do, especially the museums. But thank you very much. Nandangu.
Jolene has a... Okay. Jolene, did you have a comment? Or? So next is, I think, Gerald, McMaster. Yeah, Gerald, you can go ahead. Gerald, would you like to begin your presentation?
Hello.
We can hear you.
Hello.
Hello, we can hear you. If you would like to begin.
Yes. Okay. I just was not hearing from the other side.
Okay.
I'm assuming you can see my slides. Okay.
Yeah, we can see them, yeah.
Thank you very much. First, I'd like to thank the Sharjah Art Foundation for the invitation to speak with you today. Hello to Megan, Jolene, Brook, and Iftikhar. I really appreciate the lengths to which the Sharjah Art Foundation is taking to bring in the discussion and ideas from a historically neglected part of the world. So my talk today is entitled On the Nature of Visual Knowledge, Indigeneity, and Sovereignty. So a number of years ago, I was looking for a translation of to look and to see in my Plains Cree language, my language. I received a rather interesting response. At the time, I was involved in the naming and establishing of a new center for study in Indigenous art at OCAD University here in Toronto, Ontario, Canada. I had begun by questioning whether there was a suitable translation for visual culture in Plains Cree, which broadened into my investigation of ways of looking and seeing. The word wapata means to look or to see. What was presented to me by Plains Cree speakers was the more complex concept, ganawapatamawan, which translates basically into English as a condition or way of seeing. When I probed further, the idea of visual knowledge became an important concept of consideration. Of course, I've written about Indigenous ways of knowing. However, this was the first time I encountered the idea of visual knowledge as a novel contribution from the Indigenous perspective, from the perspective of an indigenized and sovereign lens. Initially, I was somewhat concerned about using the term. It was not an idea being pursued in art history. John Berger's foundational ways of seeing came close, but it seemed to me that his theory was intended to understand hidden ideologies found in visual images and not images as containers of knowledge itself. I took a chance and threw caution to the wind. Ganawapatamun would be the beginning of not only thinking from an Indigenous or Plains Cree perspective, but perhaps even further expanding the definition of art from an indigenized perspective. Beginning from the foundation of an original language and worldviews has since opened for me a new way of thinking. Instead of the traditional way of looking for a translation, of an English, French, or German word, such as art, in contrast, I now began from an Indigenous perspective and then translate into other languages. For far too long, I have witnessed Indigenous folks have to make excuses or come up with a reason as to why there is no word for art. The process of learning other rich histories has not expanded the ways in which I express my own unique visual knowledge. When we begin from a Western perspective, we must continue to argue from that perspective. In response to this, I find value in methods, definitions, and perspectives that further define how art can be an expansive subject of translation that considers the globally Indigenous folks who have practiced it as a form of visual knowledge or even visual sovereignty since time immemorial. For our circumstance, this means beginning from here and not from there. I would posit that Indigenous expression negotiated through Westernized understandings of art have always been inextricably tied to traditional knowledge and practices. In virtually all regions of Canada, this bond gives Indigenous contemporary artists their particular identity amongst other artists. Not long ago, many artists of Indigenous heritage sought to distance themselves from what they regarded as marginalizing ethnocultural identity. Increasingly, however, Indigenous artists in Canada are embracing indigeneity, often with a sense of ways in which connects them to other original inhabitants in different parts of the world. Thus, the idea of Ganawapatamuan reminds me of another Plains Cree term, that of Migosawan, which I observe to be another form of visual knowledge that orders the way in which the world is seen and experienced. Suggesting a divine or spiritual blessing, Migosawan extends to concepts such as intuition, foresight, thought, or vision, as well as to a person's undeveloped gifts and powers. It represents an innate talent or predisposition towards creativity itself. One way in which to consider the term is through the thought of Haida elder, and Haida is on the west coast of Canada, Guaganan Diane Brown, who noted in relation to the artist Iljuash Bill Reed, quote, "Nobody on this earth can take away what the supernaturals give," unquote. These gifts from the Creator represents a pan-Indigenous spirituality, different as a result of context, yet relatable as a common expression amongst people across Turtle Island or North America. Artistic inspiration is therefore a type of mi'osawen, yet on an ontological level, it can also refer to light, air, space, and even life itself. When the Great Spirit created humans, it gave us, with mi'osawen, the power of creativity to shape our worlds and lives. As a form of visual knowledge, it reminds us of medicine, of hunting, of storytelling, of architecture, types of intelligence that are learned, practiced, or refined over generations. It preserves memories and local knowledge passed down through family and community. Understanding the land and its animals, the fish, trees, waters, and rocks is a visual knowledge system that determines our traditional values and ways of knowing and seeing. Mi'osawen is one way to think through that innate creativity applied by hunters, spiritual leaders, astronomers, and storytellers. For artists, however, mi'osawen drives them visualize through reflection to study the visual logic of their culture and create a world from it. Important to this concept is the ethical imperative that humans must create in a good way. For Indigenous artists, cleaving to that path entails being guided by the wisdom of our community's elders and knowledge keepers. It also requires that creative decisions serve others, both human and non-human, while being respectful of community traditions and protocols. If making exists within a circle, art and spirit occupy the same space directly opposite from one another. The life force of each shifts back and forth in tension. Art is spirit, spirit is art, and both are enveloped by and make a part of what we understand as Indigenous knowledge. It would be difficult, if not impossible, to separate them from this knowledge in order to specify how one influences the other. Mi'osawen deeply embodies a commitment to a return to what once was and remains. There is an issue that presents itself while trying to understand how visual knowledge operates at the level of contemporary art practice, artistic practice. Of course, it doesn't fit the usual parameters of how art is viewed, and for that reason, such interpretations or representations of this idea must be distinguished. Yet, with greater interest in visual knowledge, contemporary artists are conducting research into new and old techniques and practices. For me, the motivation is about our ability to understand and articulate a growing phenomena of indigenization. The Wayne Linklater is Muskego Cree from the territory that falls under what is called Treaty 9, which is located in the northern geographic area of the province of Ontario in Canada. The importance of land to the Muskego cannot be underestimated. It provides not only sustenance, but also their identity as a nation. Hunting is critical for Linklater's being and artistic practice. He also acknowledges the importance of received wisdom of both his ancestors and other Indigenous peoples to his practice. Such credit subverts colonialist epistemologies and reverts to indigenous visual knowledge. In 2016, he collaborated with another indigenous artist, Brian Jungan, on a work called Modest Livelihood, which invoked indigenous knowledge and stoked the embers of the right to hunt. It is a silent film that follows Linklater and Jungan as they hunt in the lands of Jungan's people, the Daneza in northern British Columbia, also in Canada. This is art as an example of indigenous visual knowledge. The pair exercised their right, which is based on traditional activities practiced before contact with Europeans, showing that the hunt is a part of a greater ritual, which includes a prayer as an offering. Around 2014, Linklater created a group of works for an exhibition called But the Sun is Up and You're Watching? ? In the installation, freestanding clothing racks draw the viewer in. On the walls surrounding the racks are 2- and 3-dimensional works. The poetic fragments of hunted and trapped animals suggest several competing layers of meaning, cultural, economic, and political. Linklater's furs are not displayed for political purposes. Instead of hanging 1 or 2 pelts on each rack, he could have created row upon row or pile upon pile of furs to signify thoughtless consumption. Such a move might have reminded many of the wanton devastation of the bison by settler society hunters on the Great Plains of North America in the 19th century. Linklater's work is about love, respect, and memory. In another work, The State That I Seek to Name, a fisher's fur is turned inside out. Behind the fur hangs a garment bag that has a text printed on it. The last 2 lines read, "Wild fur, handle with respect." Above the text, the Janus-like logo of Fur Harvester Auction Incorporated depicts the conjoined heads of an indigenous and a European man. Between the two are the maple leaf and the beaver, iconic symbols of Canadian nationhood. The bag itself contains Linklater's own jacket, which is made in this town. Headquartered in North Bay, Ontario, Fur Harvesters Auction is a major player in the global fur market, and many of Linklater's family members have sold furs to the company. Today, the auction house sells mainly to China. Through Russia, Korea, Italy, and Greece are also major markets for Canadian furs. The words "wild fur, handle with respect" suggests the potential for careful, sustainable stewardship and harvesting of wild animals. They remind us that after the devastation of the bison herds, the species now flourishes in protected parts of Turtle Island, such as Alberta, all the way to Oklahoma in the United States. Finally, I turn to Brian Jungan. His installation at the Art Gallery of Ontario, Henry Moore's Gallery, is a call to consciousness in which he negotiates and claims a space for self-decolonization. Self-decolonization is concerned with a critical awareness of colonization as well as with interculturality and healing through the mutual exchange of ideas and forms between Indigenous peoples and settlers. The sense of self-decolonization can be spotted very early on in Jungan's practice. By applying Indigenous values and methods of making onto mass culture and modern material, Jungan not only confronts head-on the stereotype of Indigenous art as something passé, but also suggests and inspires a practice of Indigenous contemporary art that applies Indigenous visual knowledge. In Tomorrow Repeated, Jungan's works are intentionally placed within the historical canon of modern and contemporary sculpture. Through the successful incorporation of the quotidian within Indigenous materials, Jungan has been able to make his work and his understanding of Indigenous ways accessible to a broader and more international audience. Jungan contextualizes his practice beyond his Indigenous identity by claiming a place for himself as an Indigenous artist who is first and foremost an artist. These instances in which Jungan collapses tradition and contemporary practice, Indigenous knowledge, aesthetics, and materiality gives us a glimpse into Indigenous contemporary art practice on a national, if not a global level. It can be argued that contemporary art by artists such as Linklater and Jungan contribute an important role in restoring ancient practices like traditional knowledge, which is so critical for Indigenous communities today. If artists like Jungan and Linklater can help redefine a sense of visual knowledge for Indigenous communities who need it, then they have made great contributions. In conclusion, every culture has a distinct way of seeing, yet we have been conditioned through the Western history of art to see from a singular methodological perspective that is as generative as it is constricting of difference counter to its dominance. The twin ideas of language and perception have been critical in understanding historical, if not contemporary works. In other words, people who speak different languages see the world differently based on the language they use to describe it. Why can't we extend this to the visual? When people become entangled through zones of contact, new ways of seeing and new languages erupt. Have we been conditioned to deny these differences? Do we see and conceptualize the world only through European eyes? When I set about by returning to native speakers, little did I realize I would be discovering a whole new way of thinking. Art and spirit can be seen as occupying opposite points on the circumference of the circle of Indigenous knowledge. The life force of each shifting back and forth. Art is spirit, spirit is of art. It will be difficult, if not impossible, to separate art and spirit from knowledge and to specify how one influences the other. Miigwech, Ganaskum, no, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Gerald. Jolene, would you like to go next? Jolene, can you hear us? Hello?
Apologies. Okay. Tra Askanaha, a traditional greeting in the Tuscarora language, asking if you are at peace. I would like to thank the president of the Sharjah Art Foundation and Professors Salah Hassan and Iftikhar Dadi for the invitation to participate in this March meeting on decolonization. Apologies, I cannot be with you, but I hope I can be in spirit for just a few minutes this afternoon. A warm greeting to friends Brook, Gerald, and Megan. Up until the 1980s, my understanding of the use of the term sovereignty was linked to ideas of governance and settler state legal definitions. It was not anchored in European monarchical and hierarchical ideas of leadership or governance, but was normalized within Haudenosaunee culture as a way to describe our assertion of nationhood. It was invigorated with Haudenosaunee territories in the 20th century by Descahe's intervention at the League of Nations in Switzerland in 1924, but has historic influence back to the 1700s. This diplomat, Descahe, was sent by the Council at Six Nations, which is a Haudenosaunee community near Brantford, Ontario, in response to ongoing colonialism by settler states Canada and the United States, which included restrictions at the border, the Indian Act, and imposed US citizenship. Because the Six Nations Confederacy, or Haudenosaunee homelands, overlaps with land in the US and Canada, the issue of free passage in our ancestral homelands and imposed settler citizenship became symbols of sovereignty for the Haudenosaunee in the early 20th century. Therefore, the use of the term sovereignty in the 1790s was a positive affirmation of Haudenosaunee self-determination. This brief summary does not suggest other Indigenous peoples were not engaged with this idea. Rather, I am tracing a specific thread of how sovereignty was situated within Haudenosaunee consciousness and practice. Sovereignty was used as a form of mental armor by Haudenosaunee leaders and activists against further colonization and an action of self-determination. I trace a historical presence that is absent in contemporary theorization, unwittingly erasing the risk endured by Indigenous peoples' assertion of sovereignty. I recognize a schism between the way sovereignty is currently expressed amongst Haudenosaunee and Indigenous communities and how it is discussed within academia. This observation provides the opportunity to make a distinction between the theorization of this term and the enactment of sovereignty, or as described by Dylan Robertson, doing sovereignty. Recently, an entire edition of the e-journal Borderlands focused on creative sovereignty, the in-between space, Indigenous sovereignties in creative and comparative perspective. Co-authors Matthew Wildcat and Justin De Leon have identified a framework to critique multiple expressions of sovereignty based on an examination of 15 books that deal with the concept of sovereignty. Wildcat and De Leon's insight that a unique aspect of the appropriation of this term by Indigenous communities has been the use of their term descriptors, underscoring the intentional Indigenous destabilization of this term as a reflection of Westphalian sovereignty. Although Wildcat and De Leon do acknowledge the liberatory framing of intellectual sovereignty by Robert Warrior as part of the critical descriptors of sovereignty, because his work is not a singular text that didn't make the list. Yet Warrior's linkage of intellectual in 1992 was amongst the earliest add-on descriptors to sovereignty. Warrior acknowledges the influence of the eminent Lakota scholar Vine Deloria's perspective that the key to an American Indian and planetary future was the return to native traditions and ceremonies within a framework of asserting sovereignty, where he questioned what nationalism, self-determination, and group sovereignty really meant. This view of sovereignty was informed by the 1970s activism and militancy of the American Indian movement, the mobilization of urban Indians, and resurgence of customary traditions. Warrior argued that the process of sovereignty provides a way for envisioning the work we do. He asserted, what is now critical for American Indian intellectuals committed to sovereignty is to realize that we too must struggle for sovereignty, intellectual sovereignty, and allow the struggle. I argued in 1995 that the singular idea of sovereignty as a legal construct has evolved into multiple interpretations by Indigenous artists, but many Native scholars caught in a system of Western validation have not embraced this view, that the legal political assertion of sovereignty in the 20th century has always coexisted with a complex expressive imaginary of visual sovereignty. Along with warriors' intellectual sovereignty and my own notion of visual sovereignty, the first wave of descriptors to sovereignty included Beverly Singer's cultural sovereignty and Michael Diangle's dancing sovereignty. And so I'd like to develop a case study, visualizing power and Nuntawaga at Niagara Falls. Every second, 3,160 tons of water flows over Niagara Falls. Nuntawaga, one of the most famous natural wonders of the world, is also a site of mid-20th century environmental devastation and Indigenous dispossession. Part of the largest surface freshwater system on the planet, the falls, Nuntawaga, are an ancient sacred site for Haudenosaunee and the settler imaginary. Well, there have been much settler academic research examining the falls. There has also been limited cross-cultural discussion from within Haudenosaunee placemaking and cosmology. Through an intersectional analysis of Haudenosaunee eco-critical feminist narratives, Nuntawaga will be discussed as a site of restorative justice and healing as sovereignty. And so we have an early representation of the falls in the Millard George Henry engraving. We have a number of ways in which the falls have been a site for documenting the presence of Indigenous peoples, in particular the Haudenosaunee. And since the falls is 10 minutes away from the Tuscarora Nation and is at the center of the Western Door, it has become a site of both cultural and economic exchange. And so in the late 1700s, the beginning of the formation or emergence of the United States and of the Canadian states, most Indigenous peoples were dispossessed of their land at this period of time, according to Houtman, a Haudenosaunee studies scholar. The Haudenosaunee were dispossessed by more than 90% of our land in a 30-year period. And at that same point in time, we were interned to reservation territories, although it was our own homelands, rigid borders were defined, and we were essentially locked out of the emergent capitalist economy. And so the sale of beadwork at touristic sites, the sale of what our artistic expression at touristic sites became a critical way in which our people stabilized in this new environment and became a critical part of our economy. This is the kind of exuberant beadwork style that was developed to appeal to European sensibilities, in particular, the Victorian aesthetic. This is called a Tuscarora raised beadwork kind of style. And there are literally thousands of these pieces in archives all over the world because people would buy them as tourists, as items to seek a piece of the natural world, a piece of the original Americas at the brink of the falls. From the 1830s to the 1860s, Niagara Falls represented the furthest you could go in North America. And so it was still considered at that period of time as part of a Western expression of frontier. And the Tuscarora, the Seneca, the Mohawk, the Cayuga, Onondaga, and Oneida were at the brink selling the beadwork, but the Tuscarora were the primary community because of our proximity to the falls. And so all of this changed in the mid-20th century when the water in the region was identified as having particular properties that were particularly supportive of the development of the chemical industry. And so the New York State Power Authority came after the Tuscarora land, and we became embroiled in what was identified by Alvin Josephi in Red Power as one of two resistances to further dispossession in the 20th century. And so the Indian Wars, what's the so-called Indian Wars in North America, ended in the 1890s. But then we see a different form of dispossession and colonization in the 20th century. And so the US Army Corps of Engineers strategically placed damming projects adjacent to or on indigenous lands across North America, therefore further dispossessing us of more of our land and, of course, disrupting our relationship to the water. And so it's because of this, because of the earlier impact of enforced citizenship, the disruption at the border between our homelands, and now the dispossession of the New York State Power Authority for the largest damming project at that point in time in the 20th century in the United States, disrupting both the Tuscarora and the Mohawk communities. And so I grew up in an era of resistance. And this is in front of my father's family farm. And his elder brother, William Rickard, was one of the primary spokespersons for the resistance that took place within our community. We lost the battle. The US government claimed eminent domain, which is what happened across North America. And this is the actual turbine wall of the reservoir. And this is the view of the reservoir from the Tuscarora side, where the Tuscarora Nation was dispossessed of a third of our nation territory for the Niagara Power hydroelectric, holding 22 billion gallons in the reservoir, 22 billion gallons of water, which has led to redlining the entire region because it led to an unbridled ecological disaster because of the rapid and unregulated development of industry in the region. The development of this reservoir created the cheapest electricity in North America at that period of time, resulting in a world famous ecological disaster, which actually inspired the development of the EPA, which is the Ecological Oversight Committee in North America. And so we see here from a student's science project, there's 22,000 tons of over 200 different chemicals were dumped in the ditch from 1942 to 1953. And these are just some of the chemicals that are still in the water in Niagara Falls. And so this disrupts our water, and we can no longer use artesian or well water. We've had to use potable water for over 50 years in our community. And we've had many health problems because people who didn't have the resources to purchase water separately actually were drinking well water and exposed to a number of chemicals. And so I would argue this is consistent in Indigenous communities across North America. And I would argue that if we were to do a comparative analysis globally, we would see a very similar situation. And so the notion of sovereignty in this case study is really about thinking about the circumstances that have impacted Indigenous peoples within the settler-state relationship as part of an ongoing colonization. And so just adjacent to Tuscarora is Bloody Run, which actually is one of North America's most hazardous waste dumps. And this is what interrupted our water aquifer. It's located in a fractured rock. And here we have just the sense of And so when we're looking at the work of Mohawk artist Shelley Nero, this is an installation, we could see the echo or references to this earlier exuberant style of beadwork, while at the same time taking into consideration the actual physical, material, and spiritual relationship to Nandawaga or Niagara Falls. And the 1779, of course, is a reference to part of Canadian history. But it's actually, I think, within the work of Joe Jacobs, who's a Cayuga artist who's no longer with us, who's created a series of what I would argue are bounded soapstones. And they're based on the stories, the number of stories that we have in relationship to this living being. The Nandawaga is a living being, and there are other spirits that live within this space. And so he physically creates an island based on the turtle, and we could see the falls coming over here, and he's deploying one of the stories which talks about a young person going over the falls in despair. And we could see the grandfathers, which are thought of as spirits that live within the falls. We could see the thunder beings is represented right here in the necklace. And then the hair and the water fall into both the wampum belt, which shows alliance or friendship between could be between nations, could be between Indigenous, and in this case, it would be Indigenous nations. Typically, there's a white space left open when it's European nations for alliance. But then we could see it falling into the skulls. And so the interest and irony of the artist Joe Jacobs is that he grew up at Tuscarora, but he is part of the Cayuga diaspora, and he lived right next to the wall of the reservoir. And so I think that his focus and work on these traditional stories and feeling the presence of the weight of the reservoir pressed up right against his home, is part of this tension that we feel in his bounded sculptural work. And you can see here this coiled, intensely muscular serpent that is lashing out as a way of indicating the kind of tension that exists for Indigenous peoples in these spaces. Well, at the same time, you see this broad, expansive whiteness of the falls cut in soapstone, frothing over the edge. And so in Jacob's work, I think what we see is this interesting tension and dynamic, which goes right back to the beginning stories of the Haudenosaunee people, which is always to practice the good mind, and this contrast with the way in which we're always conflicted. We always have decisions to make in our lives. And he indicates this in several ways in his work. The sun and the moon, the grandmother and the father figures here in the moon and the sun, both split in half, day and night. And so, and another thing about his sculptures that he was actually really influenced by Chinese sculptors and sculptural works, early ancient works. And this is where he copied or shadowed the kind of way in which they put detail into their work. But you could see this little opening of the falls here, and then in here we could see a grandfather laying in with the serpents. And this is a metaphor for healing. And so within the stone, which is part of the teaching, that if you turn to the water, if you turn to the stone, if you turn to the natural world, it's a form of healing. And so even though this is a really tumultuous sculptural form, he puts embedded in this very optimistic teaching that it's actually our relationship to beings other than human that can actually heal us. And so there are multiple ways in which I think artists in our communities today are expressing sovereignty and also at the same time creating new narratives of restorative justice. And so the work of Jacobs, I think, is part of that continuum. And we also see echoes in the work of contemporary digital artists like Waylon Wilson, who provides us with a modest sketch of a new game that he's working on on the brink of the falls. And so I'd like to thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jolene. So Megan, would you like to come and make your presentation?
Thank you. Too many things. Tēnā rā koutou i te iwi, i ngā āhuatanga o tō tātou rā e. Ko Taranaki tuku maunga, ko Waitara tuku awa, ko Tiati awa rawa ko Ngaitahu oku iwi, ko Mururau patu rawa ko Tamatia oku marae, ko Raniere irihana rawa ko Hananani wala oku tūpuna, ko Megan Tamati-Quennell taku ingoa. The introduction I gave is a brief mihi, which is also sometimes used as a karanga or a customary call of welcome that senior Māori women deliver, taught to me by my mother. and a Iftikhar which introduces me and acknowledges my place in the world. The Iftikhar talks about the lands, the whenua, lands, waters and people I belong to, and embodies who I am and how I am able to stand here today. My mihi is also an acknowledgement of Hoa El-Kasimi and the Sharjah Art Foundation, who invited me to be here. Thank you so much. And as a greeting and acknowledgement of my co-presenters in tuakana, and tuakana means elders, or like elder brother or sister, Jolene, Rickard, Gerald, McMaster, Brook, Andrew, and Iftikhar Dadi. As this session focuses on indigeneity and sovereignty, I wanted to start my brief presentation by defining tino rangatiratanga, a te reo Māori term related to sovereignty, with tino being a superlative and meaning very, full, total and absolute. The word tino rangatiratanga features in two founding documents of New Zealand. The first is he whakapūtanga or te rangatiratanga or Nutirini, or also known in English as the Declaration of Independence of the United Tribes of New Zealand, and it was dated 1835. He whakapūtanga was signed by 34 Northern Māori chiefs at Waitangi and at the home of James Busby, a British resident. Made up of 4 handwritten articles, it recognised Nutirini, or New Zealand, to be a sovereign and independent nation, and declared that all sovereign power and authority resided entirely and exclusively with the rangatira, or the Māori chiefs of New Zealand. It also outlined that the foreigners were not able to make laws. By 1839, 52 Māori rangatira or chiefs had signed whakapūtanga, and the declaration was officially recognised by the British government. The British government saw it as a document that would prevent other countries making deals or treaties with Māori. The second document is the Treaty of Waitangi, which was signed on the 6th of February 1840, again by rangatira Māori chiefs and the Crown. In the treaty, and that's the key document that people work with today, it was promised that tino rangatiratanga would be guaranteed to Māori, that the chieftainship and iwi, the leaders and the people, would retain full tino rangatiratanga of our lands, our kāinga, which is where we lived, our waterways, and all of our taonga and cultural treasures, which included our laws, our language, our customs, and our ways of life. Retaining tino rangatiratanga, which translates really as complete responsibility, full authority, and absolute sovereignty, meant that even with signing the Treaty of Waitangi that gave the Crown limited power to control the new settlers, Māori ability to define and control our destiny was not diminished. Many breaches of the treaty have been related to successive governments to this day, relying on the English version of the treaty for their legitimacy and their own unilateral proclamation of sovereignty. Māori signed the Māori version rather than the English version of the treaty. The wording for each is quite different. The Māori version guaranteed our tino rangatiratanga and our absolute sovereign power and authority. To speak from a Māori position, like the Iftikhar I gave at the beginning of this presentation, means you speak from your tūranga waiwai, the particular whenua you are connected to as mana whenua, or the people of the land, the place or the places that enable you to even stand. In keeping with that, I wanted to start with a few images from a recent exhibition I curated for the Govett Brewster Art Gallery in New Plymouth called Swallowing Geography. So, do I just press this? How do I do that? Which one do I press? That one, okay. Swallowing Geography took its title from a book by British writer Deborah Levy. I just really liked the title, in which she questioned history, disconnection and identity. She later wrote, if I do not recognise myself in the history that has been written for me, how might I speak of my own history, of what I value and who I love? Swallowing Geography was an exhibition that explored our relationship with land and how we absorb landscape, our built environment, and how we take in the histories of site and place. It was an exhibition that was centred on the particular lands and histories of Taranaki, lands I whakapapa to or connect to tribally on both sides of my family. Some geographies elicit a celebratory recognition of the rich and distinct local cultures that have evolved over time. Other geographies hold traumatic histories and speak of environmental and cultural exploitation, of rupture, violence, displacement, alienation, or as artist Onāianei put it, of a friction that parallels the processes of colonisation and industrialisation. Taranaki contains both. The show also encompassed, as Kate Newby's work described, peripheral situations, the ephemeral nature of interactions, and the overlooked everyday. 4 artists, Matt Penny, Shona Peter Davies, Kate Newby and Onāianei were commissioned to create site-responsive works for the exhibition. So here's some of the interpretations of the land, sites and histories of Taranaki. The first 2 images are works by Matt Penny, who called himself a post-minimalist Māori artist. Sadly, he passed away just before the show opened, actually. These two works focus on a pre-European form of Māori architecture related to land modification, that of power sites or of a form of Māori earthworks. They are works that come from his F series or his fortification series that were conceived in 1997, made in 1979 and remade in 2021 for this show. The first image, which is the one that's up here, is called Te Porere Variation. It's based on one of the last major battle sites of the land wars, a site that Matt is connected to tribally. The second is called Impressions on Gate Pa, originally made in 1979 but re-realised for this show. The first work was an original work from 1979, I have to say. It relates to 3 actions or movements that could have been carried out at Pukehinahina or Gate Pa, designed by Peni Takatuaia in 1864. And it's where trench warfare was invented, actually, by this man, Peni Takatuaia. So the climbing, so the movements were climbing, which is the ladder, crawling, which was the bridge, and creeping, which is the frame that you can see could creep through it. So again, it was really about mapping that landscape but bodily, which I really liked. The next images are works by Kate Newby. The works took in the situations of sight. She's a non-Māori artist, Kate, but I find her work extraordinary. Her gestures are very slight, and she just kind of transforms the gallery and environment and kind of invites the artist. She doesn't transgress anything. She kind of does this urban foraging too, where she finds bits of glass and bits of metal and things around the gallery site, and she moulds them and creates them puts them into her bricks, makes bricks from earth. I mean, her work's really extraordinary. So ask the audience to navigate the gallery much more kind of consciously. So you could actually stand on her work and walk around on it. And they always remind me of middens. There's ones that she does carves into the ground, and middens, of course, are archaeological digs where you might have shells, and it's kind of like our rubbish dumps. So she makes these middens that run along the floor, and she's the most extraordinary artist. The last works are by Shona Peter Davies. Her installation referenced the land wars in Taranaki, which began in Waitara, and saw all the land from my family confiscated and given to the soldiers involved in the armed conflict that took place between the settler government and Māori in March 1860 to March 1861. And we lost all our lands completely. There was the land wars started, or they used to call them the Māori Wars, but they were the land wars started in Waitara over one contested piece of land, and my family ended up living on what was called the Queen's Chain, which is the gap between the river and the township that was called the Queen's Chain. The final images, again, reference power sites or land fortifications. I mean, they dot the landscape. They're throughout the landscape. They're in the land. So these ones are land fortifications in Auckland, the whenua that Shona particularly connects with. I put them in also so that they would link with Matt Penny's. There was a senior woman in that show, Shona, a senior man, a younger artist, as in Kate, mid-career, and then an emerging artist, Ana Iti. The second show I wanted to talk about briefly was called Surrealist Impulse, a small show that I curated which explored a localised and Māori relationship with surrealism. It featured the work of two leading artists, Michael Pari-Korwhai. I seem to have lost an image, have I? No? Oh, you have to go there. Michael Pari-Korwhai and Shane Cotton, whose positionality is Māori and whose work referenced surrealist artists such as René Magritte and Marcel Duchamp, although Duchamp is not strictly a surrealist. Pari-Korwhai has had an ongoing conversation with Duchamp since he was at art school in the late 1980s. His relationship with Magritte is less recognised, but much of Pari-Korwhai's work, like Magritte's, is a conundrum or a puzzle to be thought through and worked out. The image shown is a sculpture called Folie à Deux that can be translated as the madness of two and describes a psychiatric syndrome that is transmitted from one individual to another. A giant chess set, the sculpture makes direct reference to Duchamp, to art as play, but also as tools employed to think with, and to biculturalism, the postmodern ideological construct peculiar to New Zealand, the evolving partnership between Māori and the Crown. So I have to jump back to this image. Shane Cotton's three paintings, Third Eye, Fantasyland and Reach, also reference Magritte, small domestic scale works. They were made in response to seeing Magritte's famous The Treachery of Images, This Is Not a Pipe painting at LACMA in LA. Cotton's paintings collapse together imagery from Magritte and from the Māori modernists, a small group of pioneering Māori artists who intentionally distanced themselves from customary Māori art and instead explored the styles and techniques of international modern art. They are credited with creating a new Māori art, an alternate or a Māori form of modernism, and as being the founders of the contemporary Māori art movement. The paintings were drawn from a show called The Smoking Gun, which used the arrival of the gun that changed the iwi and Māori landscape completely as an analogy for the arrival of modernism and its impact on the culture. The other imagery contained in Cotton's works are related to Ngā Poropiti, or the Māori prophetic movements. Ngā Poropiti, or the Māori prophetic movements, were seminal interchanges, highly political, spiritual and artistic movements that emerged in the 1830s, but were most active between 1860 and 1890. Ngā Poropiti, or the Māori prophetic movements, were born of a period of dramatic cultural change, the chaos of the land wars, which ran from 1845 through to 1872, a series of localised conflicts between settler governments and Māori, triggered by disputes over land purchases. Many of the Māori prophetic movements, like the surrealist movements, were informed by dreams. Papahurihia, Te Ua Haumini, Te Whiti and Tohu, Te Kōti Ariki, Rangi, Te Tūruki, Ruakenana, Te Maiharoa, Wiramu Tahu Pōtiki Ratana are some of the Māori leaders associated with these movements. Each played a crucial role in developing a model for the future and provided a new template for Māori existence. Utopian visions and sovereign movements, Ngā Poropiti, were an antidote to the invasion, colonisation and acculturation Māori were experiencing, and were a conscious commitment to Māori survival. That's just a close-up of Reach. The last show I wanted to touch on was a show called Two Artists, Shona Rapira Davies and Emily Karaka. Both Emily and Shona Davies are senior Māori women artists who've been creating work since the 1970s. Their work can be associated with Mana Wahine Māori, a conceptual framework that express the authority and power of Māori women specifically and their right to name and represent Māori women's concerns. Karaka and Rapira Davies, I'll just move to the next image, that's Emily's painting, added their voice as art makers to the growing expression of Māori discontent in the 1970s and 80s at our loss of lands, lack of power, marginal status and alienation compared with the position of the dominant Pākehā or New Zealand Europeans. They were described at the time like others in the Māori protest movement by academic Dr. Ranginui Walker as the firstborn urban Māori intelligentsia, an articulate and eloquent anti-colonial voice which emerged to argue for a shift in nationalism to biculturalism. They and their contemporaries were the first to embody issues of Māori women's sovereignty within their artwork. Before them, Māori women had little or no presence within mainstream New Zealand art. More than simply a Māori version of feminism, mana wahine Māori was bound up culturally and spiritually, like Māori women's identity with land and geography. Tino rangatiratanga and the acts and actions of tūpuna wahine or female ancestors were cited as foundations for Māori women's well-being and integral to mana wahine Māori. Mana wahine Māori was also part of the broader discourse of the Māori protest movement and in the larger decolonising agenda conveyed by other Māori women leaders like Dame Whina Cooper, who led the hikoi to Rōpū Matakiti, meaning those with vision or foresight, the Māori Land March of 1975, Eva Rickard, Donna Awatere, and Hana Tihemara, and many more. That's it from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Megan, and thank you to all four of you for laying out a very rich set of ideas and contexts. It's there's a lot to talk about. Obviously, there is all of you touched on kind of the issues of kind of compromised sovereignty and dispossession and the struggles really in recent times to claim sovereignty in various forms, in which includes legal, cultural representations, but also in a sense making these claims global through kind of the United Nations Declaration, and that becomes an important touchstone as well. One of the things I was struck by looking at the artwork is really the very surprisingly the artistic forms that this new art seems to be taking are very, very surprising, and I mean that in a good way, right? They're very unexpected forms, and to people who are not necessarily used to or habituated to the histories that each of these artists is addressing, and I think there's something very powerful and surprising and striking about much of this work that is coming out. What I wanted to do is, for our audience, it may be good also to reflect a little bit more broadly, and may I ask each of you to say, what do you think has, if you were to sketch in very broad strokes, what has changed in the last 20 or 30 years, and where do you think, and by that I mean artistic practice, but also patronage structures and other and scholarship, that all of which are important to think about when we think about the kind of the practice and the support that artists need to continue with their work. Also museum, support by museums or patronage, and also scholarship on each of your sites and communities that you're dealing with. So perhaps Brook, if I may start with you, and we can go in that order.
Up. There we go. That was great, Megan. And thank you, Iftikhar. Scholarship. I mean, it's... No, I understand what you're saying.
Art doesn't arise in a vacuum, right? It arises in, with activism and with support and with the kind of thinking, that both Gerald and also you with your own writing has been, with the play that you're writing. So what I mean is that, that what's the relationship of, let's say the art objects and artistic practice to this wider domain of thinking and reclaiming sovereignty? And, what support are you seeing, and what is still lacking, I guess? So, yeah, I mean, very broad questions, and feel free to address them in any way that you wish.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's interesting because Megan and I were talking before and really reflecting on the other presentations that were here so far. And we were even talking about, well, what is indigeneity? What are these kind of spaces that the United Nations created? I know that Jolene has spoken, quite, extraordinarily about this. And of course, for us at home, and I think that's why I showed that map, that complex map of Australia. I mean, a lot of us are absolutely dispossessed. We didn't have one particular treaty. I think I didn't have an opportunity to talk about treaties or, sovereignty in that context. There were actual treaties, and when we talk about Australia and Indigenous Australia, we talk about nations. And for me to talk about scholarship and all these other things that you're asking me to do, I think that often we're asked too much, quite frankly. It's like we have to have all the answers for everybody on the outside. And that's the kind of thing that I was trying to talk about in my presentation about when balancing trauma with with healing. And even my Aboriginal grandmother said to me, Brook, you're also white, clearly. I'm also white. A couple of my, a lot of us Indigenous people are. We're mixed. I mean, some of us look in Australia Japanese, some look Chinese. I mean, the frontier has been happening for 200 years, 250 years. But coming back to this context about scholarship and about even being here, and even what Spivak talked about, being the privileged here, I think that this whole, I want to get to this, maybe I'm thinking now I might sound quite abstract, but quite frankly, for me to leave my community and my grassroots community and to be on this stage and to go into museums, it is a very abstract space to be. And we're completely negotiating what that means, and it's a completely moving feast, and people have expectations on us to know everything or to be certain things. And I think what Gerald was talking about before, about very, honing in, about, specific practices. I mean, all of us, in this panel have talked about history, healing, disposition, language, and we've talked about our own ways of being. And I think that really is the thing that's the most important thing for me to answer your question.
Gerald, we maybe go with you next.
I'm not sure if you indicated me or you're following the roster of speakers. Yeah. So the question, what has changed in the last 30 years? One of the things that I think our audience, your audience, or the audience has to know is certainly in Canada, and if not in the United States, that Indigenous peoples up until about the 1960s were coming out of a period of erasure. Ever since the late 19th century, about 70 odd years of erasure in every manner whatsoever, whether it was cultural, linguistic, children sent off to be totally assimilated. So every aspect of that. So since the 60s, there's been a tremendous amount of movement. And I think the cultural sector, the artists, were very much a part of that. Jolene mentioned the American Indian movement and the rise of that movement in the late 60s. I think all that came together. But in the last 30 years, what we are seeing now, and I'm really quite pleased. I'm at the end of my career, actually. And, you know, I see that there are so many brilliant artists and curators and arts administrators, at least here in this country in Canada, that are showing everywhere. And every major institution in this country is now exhibiting Indigenous artists. They're collecting Indigenous artists. They're hiring Indigenous curators, arts administrators. And so if none have, as I said to somebody, if none have, they better catch up. And you will note that in some of the biennales, and I'm not even sure of Sharjah yet, but biennales such as the one that Brook just curated. I curated back in 2012, the Biennale of Sydney. And even before that, there were Indigenous artists in these exhibitions. So they are exhibiting alongside other global artists. And I believe that, that they themselves are unapologetic. And I think they're bringing, and which I wanted to argue, and I tried to argue, that they're unapologetic. They are coming from a particular position of this erasure. And so that's what happens when you are erased. You are going to come back in a very different form. And sometimes it could be angry, but I believe it's also in a very articulate way.
Jolene?
Thanks, Gerald. I guess I'll just pick it up from here. So what's changed in the past 20, 30 years? I think there are a number of things that have changed. In the 1960s to 70s, early 80s, what I recognized in North America is that, of course, at that period of time, people were referring to themselves as Native Americans or First Nations. So just the naming of our own subjectivities has now become much more centered with confidence on our own heritage. And not only the names that have been situated within the archive and within the colonial record, but the names, the way in which we refer to ourselves in our language, which Gerald touched upon, is, which I think all of our speakers today touched upon, the presence and use of our language is with confidence as a way to express our epistemological and philosophical framings in the world. In that early period, we saw artists from our community seeking inclusion and not calling out their particular subjectivities as Native peoples, but seeking seamless inclusion within a so-called mainstream. And now, I think what we see is an insistence upon recognizing your place-based relationship to territory or heritage in conjunction with your cosmopolitanism. And so I think that this fluidity of insisting upon both a centeredness in your own indigeneity, the insistence on a comparative indigeneity that has been going on, and a number of the people on the panel today have been leaders in opening up that space, and also then a relationship to community. And so I think in 30 years, we see both a confidence in engaging with global art markets, while at the same time, an insistence on being responsible to the communities that we come from, and then also the rejection of the notion of community as only reservation territory or nation territory, but the notion of community as transcending these geopolitical colonial borders. And so there's a kind of remapping of conceptual Indigenous space. And so in a sense, the artists are leading the way to recovering in all of these spaces around the world an Indigenous claim to our land, and also a kind of reigniting or re-engagement with these very ancient observational practices that have actually centered our people for millennia. And so it's actually the artists, you know, that are plumbing these traditions as a way of calling both attention, not just the art product, the art space, but calling attention also within our communities to the importance of these traditions. Thanks for asking, Iftikhar.
Thank you. Megan, if you have thoughts on this?
Oh, I don't know if there's anything more to add. I agree with everything that's been said, of course. I think in New Zealand, in the last 20 or 30 years, there's been a number of shifts. Some of them around settlements of treaty claims with tribes. So one of my tribes in the South Island settled, Ngāi settled with the Crown in 1997, and they basically occupy most of the South Island, and now they're as big as government, you know, in terms of what's happening there. Ngāi are a tribe and a force kind of to be recognised, but with that also comes responsibility that they have to step up and not only do things for Ngāi good, but also for the greater good. And so that's a kind of a different position than we've ever been in. And there's different things happening at different stages in terms of art. There has been an opening of space for artists to occupy kind of the mainstream art gallery, but that's only happened in the last 20, 30 years, and there's still a huge amount to do in terms of scholarship. And I feel for someone like myself, I'm one of 2 Māori art curators in the country who specialise in this area and have for 30 years. And so you're actively writing art histories through exhibition making, because they are histories that don't exist actually. They've been left outside of the mainstream art histories. And so you're actively writing art histories and curating projects that acknowledge that there is an art history. There is a Dr. Rangi Pānoho, Te Rangihiro Pānoho wrote the first kind of Māori art history, but you know, it's like land architecture theory, it's like huge, you know, and he's an extraordinary man who wrote the first kind of Māori art history since a guy called Sir Apiranga Ngata wrote one, but back in the 1920s. So he's written a contemporary art history. I mean, it's an extraordinary book and an extraordinary offering, so those things are happening. And there are other scholars that are doing work, but in the curatorial space, there's still very few. I'm actively trying to recover things like looking at, you know, the whole project I do around Māori modernism, and looking at the women of Māori modernism. Of course, they've never had an exhibition. Nobody knows who they are. The first woman to graduate, or the first actually Māori person to graduate from a fine arts school, Elam School of Fine Arts, was a female, was a woman called Pauline Yeabury, who graduated in 1947. But of course, everybody says, you know, historically, it was Selwyn Wilson, 1951, or Arnold Wilson, 1952. So she, you know, nobody knew who she was and how incredible. So doing work to kind of, and there's a kind of an urgency, because those women are now in their 80s, and most of them have gone. And so trying to kind of capture that now. So, but that's, you know, so you do have a sense of responsibility. I agree with Jolene, you both work from, it was interesting, all of us talked about how kind of culturally located, we talked from our own position and then moved out. So it's not like you're only talking from that position. And of course, you are cosmopolitan as well and part of the world. And I suppose that that perhaps for my mother and my mother's generation, and my grandmother's generation and my great-grandmother's generation, maybe my great-grandmother's generation had it better than my grandmother and my mother, you know. My great-grandmother had more freedom, I think, to be of and from something, and be what she wanted to be in the world. My grandmother, my mother, because of assimilationist practices, not at all. And people like myself are like, my generation, that kind of stuff has to stop with me. Because I can't necessarily change what happened, but I can definitely have some power over what happens in the future. Sorry, that was a big, long answer.
No, thank you, everyone. Perhaps, you know, we can perhaps have questions from any members of the audience, questions or comments. Anyone? So please say your name.
This is not working. Boom. My name is Gavin Janchez. I want this thing. Yes, it is. I want to ask all the speakers included. I've never been in a karaoke, so why you didn't include any contemporary artists in your presentation, whereas all the others did? And I want to just specifically ask why that was so, and their relevance to the arguments you were making about indigeneity. I'm thinking of people like Gordon Bennett, or Dorothy Napanjadi, or Emily Kingwari, or Daniel Boyd, are contemporary artists who have contributed and are, in fact, Emily, as you know, is a national treasure. What relevance do you think these contemporary artists have made, precisely in the previous question, in the last 20 years of development, in the recognition of Aboriginal contribution to Australian art?
I'm an art historian, so I was invited here to talk about my practice. But of course, Emily Kingwari, extraordinary artist from Aranta country, all of her Yam Dreaming stuff, of course, you know, breaking all the records internationally. If we're going to talk about famous Indigenous artists from Australia, of course, you know, all the other people you've spoke about is extraordinary. You know, I wasn't avoiding Iftikar's question about the last 20 or 30 years, but I think that one thing that I've been involved in, excuse me, is called the Galang Project, and Galang means together, and it's something that we're doing at the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences in Sydney, also known as the Powerhouse Museum, and they asked me to come and do some consulting on, you know, Indigenous consulting, and we're often reduced to these kind of things within museum context. They want us to come in and kind of give them the tick of approval, and I said, I don't want to do that. I want to support other Indigenous artists from around the world that really don't have a voice. And so within that Galang project, I'm connecting with Moinkiki, who's Ainu from Hokkaido, you know, people like Lisa Ravnafimbog, who's Sami, and others. And it's a really extraordinary way to be able to support not only Indigenous artists, but thinkers. And so my space is not as an art historian. I see myself, like my presentation of my arts practice, as, you know, grassroots. And I think that the four of us are extremely lucky who are speaking here. We know each other. We've known each other for a really long time. You can see our solidarity internationally. But there are many other, you know, Indigenous peoples around the world who do not have the same histories that we have in the last 30 years. I'm not saying that necessarily that's a good thing. I mean, I know that Megan and I, and also Wanda Nanabush, was at the Tate Modern about 4 years ago, and one of the, you know, the curators in painting said, I don't understand Bart painting, and let's not talk about primitivism again, and the kind of legacy of that, and the trauma of that, and the blindness of that. I mean, there's so much incredible joy of Indigenous creativity and spirituality, etc. And I said to him, I said, oh, right, so a Picasso, what's it made from? And he said, oh, it's made from, you know, paint and, you know, linen. I said, that's ochre. That's where it comes from the earth. And that linen that you're talking about is bark. So if we're going to, really reflect on the context of what we're all talking about here, we really have to look at a bit more than 30 years. You have to look at before Enlightenment. I don't think we have enough time to talk about that today, though. But thank you.
Other questions or comments?
Hello. Hello.
Hi.
From here, you.
Hello. Yeah. Hi.
Hello.
Yes, it was a good talk. I had a question.
Please say your name.
Yeah, my name is Bryce. Yeah, I listened to all your conversations about Indigenous art and how we can take steps to promote it. Now, my question for the panel here is this, like now, especially in the time that we are living right now, we are living in a world where almost every art form that we see right now is getting commercialized. We see the NFT world taking great shape and momentum right now. So given this age and time where NFTs are becoming the fad that we live in today, how do you all see Indigenous art, in contrast to this? Like, how do you all position Indigenous art in the sideline of the growing popularity for NFTs? That is my question for y'all. Because a lot of art is getting commercialized and people are looking more at the commercial side of, or commercial value of this, of art. So how do y'all see this with regards to Indigenous art?
NFT, NFT and Indigenous art.
If I understand it.
Just no.
Okay, no is the answer. All
No, not even NFTs.
Other questions?
Yes.
What is NFT? It's hard to hear. Jolene, I'm not sure if you're having the same problem. It's hard to hear. They keep cutting out. And
So
so
NFTs
parts
are non-fungible tokens. It's a new thing in the digital world right now, where you're able to actually create your art digitally and sell it as a digital print and some of them are going for very high prices, so you own the digital copy. That's what an NFT is, for someone who asked. And actually, they're now, through NFTs, they're looking into also selling real estate, so space in virtual reality. It's an insane new digital transformation, not for this conversation, but.
I think it's beyond us, or certainly beyond my comprehension at this point. But I think in terms of, I can respond maybe to the commercialization part of the art, because there is a long history of commercializing indigeneity, and it was first started by, I mentioned earlier about the erasure of every cultural practice in Canada by the federal government, the colonial governments, to erase. And so in that erasure, they felt that Indigenous peoples needed some kind of economy, something that was safe, that didn't allow us to practice our everyday lives. So they felt that maybe we could start with very small commercial practices by selling what they called craft in those days. And that was safe. And so that was done across this country. So this long period of exchanging materiality with Europeans and Euro-Canadians has a long, long history. And certainly it has morphed into contemporary art. But at the same time, in this long line of commercializing material, there is a pushback where artists are now returning to communities. And I think Jolene was also talking about that, returning back to communities and engaging in cultural practices at home, creating things that are used in ceremony and other community purposes. So there is that push. So they're able to shift and provide opportunities for themselves and other artists to live in multiple worlds and in a multiverse. And so I think that on the one hand, yes, commercialization is going to be a reality, and NFTs, whatever that is, it's going to be taken advantage of. But that's commercializing, of course. That's always going to exist. But at the same time, I think the freedom to return and to live these lifestyles, they're not traditional lifestyles by any means, but they're just engaging with what our communities have long engaged with and are part of our cultural survival. And I would think the same as in the Middle East with communities there that are considered indigenous. I would think that there's probably opportunities that are given to artists the same way.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense, Jolene showed the example of the objects made for tourists, in the Niagara area, and so I think the question of the commercial value of kind of indigenous art, the way it was promoted, at a certain point in history, and then the more recent practices that may have a commercial dimension, but definitely have spiritual and critical kind of dimensions also needs to be kept in mind. So I think. The question of NFT, I think, will be answered by, I don't know if there's one answer, it will be answered differently, but this is some of the context perhaps that would inform, some of the practices. So I'm told that there is, we have only time for one last question, which is on the right, here somewhere.
Yeah, hello.
Yeah, so please announce your name before you ask your question.
Yeah, sir. This is me, myself, Azhar. I want to ask is, does the barbaric concept of stolen generation still exist in present day Australia? And how did it affect the indigenous art at that point in time? And does it exist in any other milder forms in Australia right now?
Do you mean the effect of the stolen generations on Indigenous art? Well, it created, extraordinary places of creativity. I mean, often these difficult places, artists are always doing it. I mean, Rashid was talking about it today. There are incredible musicians like Uncle Archie Roach, who sings and is incredibly famous about his experience of being taken away as a child. It's very painful for us. I mean, my grandmother, I remember her mother actually died in childbirth. And they were all very worried because some of their family were fair-skinned, which were ripe for the picking, and some were darker-skinned. But the way in which that, the first time now, we actually have a Minister for Indigenous Affairs who actually is Indigenous, the Honourable Ken White, and there are some reparations at the moment. So some stolen generation survivors have been paid money, but as far as the arts is concerned as well, right across the art sector, it has been incredible subjects to paint, to draw, theatre, song, dance, film. There's Rabbit Proof Fence that you may have heard of. It's quite a famous film. I hope that answered the question for you.
So we are out of time. So please join me in thanking our speakers and our panelists for their wisdom.